Hello. Some events in life have ripple effects that flow for decades, in some cases an entire lifetime. That's certainly the case with Beth Heinrich. We've followed her story now for years at Australian Story. She was left permanently damaged by something that happened to her when she was a teenager. And for almost half a lifetime, she's chased the Anglican Church for justice. It's pitted her against one of the institution's most powerful figures, the former Governor-General and Bishop Peter Hollingworth.
I really enjoy driving, it doesn't matter where, because I'm in control. No one else is there. And if I want to yell, I can yell and swear and sing or whatever I want to do. I'm in my own space and I'm protected from outside.
Beth has shown the most extraordinary courage. Out of all the cases of child sexual abuse that I have known, this has gone on the longest. Beth was abused 70 odd years ago.
This week, 87-year-old Dr. Hollingworth fronted an Anglican tribunal, which is deciding whether to defrock the former Archbishop over his handling of child sex abuse claims. There's lots of victim survivors that have made complaints against Dr. Peter Hollingworth, but Beth Heinrich is the spearhead, if you like. She's the one that is putting her name to it.
To Dr. Hollingworth and the Anglican Church, this is just the beginning.
Beth wants Dr. Hollingworth to be held accountable for any of his decisions of the past that have involved really protecting pedophiles at the expense of victims. He is still a bishop in the Melbourne Anglican Diocese. He's still wearing his bishop's ring. She wants him to lose his officiating powers. And Beth is not giving up in that battle.
I feel this is my chance to speak up. It's an example for others and hopefully it'll give them the strength to keep at it. Peter Hollingworth shattered my belief in Jesus' teaching because of his standing in the church. You expect more from leaders. They're to set an example. I keep the copies of letters sent and received because it's all a story that people find difficult to believe. That's the proof that it did happen.
I do wonder why Peter Hollingworth continues to have permission to officiate. It's a good thing that people like Beth Heinrich raise their concerns and keep on raising them. The whole thing has been a sorry saga. It's been a tragedy, really. A tragedy for the people who've been impacted by child sexual abuse, absolutely.
Beth is a very bright, articulate woman who has amazing strength of character. She might have been a very different person, of course, if she hadn't been abused as a child.
I went to live at St John's Hostel in Forbes when I was 14. My parents had a farm and it was a long way from town, so I had to go there to attend high school. The hostel was run by the Anglican Church. Donald Shearman was the assistant priest in Forbes, and he and his wife Faye were in charge of the hostel. So they took the place of my parents while I was there. We called him Padre. My roommate was a younger girl, Wendy Ryan, who we called Chick. She's now Wendy McCarthy and prominent in a lot of areas.
As young girls in the hostel,
our first time away from home, we were all vulnerable. Don was handsome, charismatic, charming, intelligent. We valued his approval very, very deeply and trusted him. I would have trusted him with my life.
How old were you in this one?
I would have been 15.
Donald Shearman was well liked within the church, and that makes it very difficult for Beth in that she felt for many years who would believe her. Donald Shearman had spotted her young and impressionable, and he let her know that she was a bit special to him, and she was flattered by that. He then began to give presents to Beth. She still has a string of pearls from Christmas 1954. And it was just a few months later, when she was 15, that he first had sexual intercourse with her.
I had no idea at all. When I look back, I wonder why Beth. She was just a kind of nice, average kid who was going to school each day, really.
From then on, Padre Shearman would have sex with me at every opportunity. And I had lots of letters from him. He was always talking about our future, and he used to say, "What will your parents say when I tell them I want to marry you?" But then the Shearmans had one child, and in early 1956, I realised she was pregnant again. It was like I'd been walloped in my heart with a sledgehammer. Yes.
One night, about a month after the Shearman's baby was born, Beth and another girl went to the movies and got a ride home with some boys. They were a little late getting back to the hostel, and Padre Shearman was waiting for them in an agitated state.
He pushed the other girl up the stairs, got hold of me and said, "Where have you been? What have you been doing? I can smell smoke in your hair. I've had enough. I'm ringing your parents in the morning." I was sent home in disgrace, and my parents were told that I'd been promiscuous with some boys in a car, and I could never ever tell them the truth.
Expelling Beth from the hostel was probably one of the most wicked things he's ever done. He used her as a scapegoat for his own lust, and then chopped her off when it got a bit too close to home.
Her parents were so shocked that this had happened that she was in pain in her relationship with her parents for the rest of her life. They believed Don. And I tell you, he was believable. She lost her self-esteem, she lost a chance to an education, and she devalued herself in subsequent relationships. After Beth was sent home, Donald Shearman's career took off. He was promoted to the position of bishop. He received an OBE. He became a very, very powerful figure and person within the Anglican Church.
I met this farmer and started going out with him. I had 5 children, and I think they've all suffered because of the violence in that marriage. I thought I was worthless.
Beth went to a local priest and asked him to help her leave her husband. He refused, and in desperation she phoned Donald Shearman. It was 21 years since she'd last seen him, and she was really only hoping for some help in finding a place to live with her children away from the violence.
My darling, thank you for coming into my life. No longer the young girl, but the mature woman bearing the honourable scars of the last 21 years.
Donald Shearman doesn't let go of Beth. He continues to write to her. He continues to pledge his undying love for her. He keeps her entrapped for many, many years after he assaulted her as a child.
She left her husband twice, and the bishop would visit her. At other times, they would rendezvous whenever they could. He wrote frequently, promising to marry her.
I do believe that our being together is part of God's plan for us both, and the way will be made clear.
In early 1984, Donald sent a suitcase of clothes and a lot of personal items, as well as his coin collection and stamp collection, to me in Wagga Wagga. Then in April, he left his wife and the church and came to live with me. And he said that in 12 months' time, I'd be his Easter bride. And I was just absolutely ecstatic.
A couple of weeks after Donald Shearman moved in with Beth, all hell broke loose. The church flew in, picked him up and flew him out. At that stage, Beth hadn't told the Anglican Church, the other bishops, about what happened to her when she was a child. So at this point, the church is still blaming Beth for everything that was happening.
It was very hard for Beth to accept. Suddenly it was over, and she had to have felt abused, she had to have felt betrayed, she had to have felt abandoned.
She sought help at that time and began to realise that she'd invested all her hopes and dreams in his promises. In doing so, she'd excused his behaviour and ruined her own life in the process.
In 1995, Beth approached the church asking for help and understanding about what had happened to her and what had been done over the intervening years. Although the abuse by Shearman occurred in New South Wales, Shearman then moved to Queensland, and he came under the auspice, if you like, of Archbishop Hollingworth in Brisbane.
The only form of help that is of real value is the help that will empower the other person.
The church set up a mediation session between Shearman and Beth. They said that they would like to hear her story. It was then asked by Hollingworth, Archbishop Hollingworth, if he could attend as an observer to this mediation session.
I made it my business to see some therapists, and they actually wrote reports on the effects that Donald Shearman's abuse had on me and forwarded them to the Brisbane diocese prior to the mediation. Donald opened with a tirade of how it was time I put it all behind me and got on with my life, and that I had actually encouraged him when I was a schoolgirl. And I said, are you going to sit there and say that you weren't involved with me sexually when I was a schoolgirl and in your care? And he said, on the contrary, I went to the bishop in Bathurst and confessed and wanted to resign, but he wouldn't let me.
What Beth wanted most from the mediation was for Donald Shearman to sign a letter that she had written to her parents from him. The letter said she had done nothing wicked when she was a schoolgirl.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Heinrich, it's now over 40 years since I first harmed Beth. Beth never did anything for you to be ashamed of or to disappoint you. I destroyed her girlhood.
The parents had died at this stage, but that's the sort of effect that it had on her. Unfortunately, Donald Shearman refused to sign the letter. Afterwards, Beth expected to meet privately with Archbishop Hollingworth, but he said he had a pressing engagement and couldn't meet with her.
Here was one of his bishops out of line, big time, and Hollingworth had something more important to do. It was astounding.
After the failed mediation, Beth wrote a letter to Archbishop Hollingworth demanding that Bishop Shearman be stopped from preaching and asking for $100,000 compensation. Archbishop Hollingworth wrote back a very legalistic letter to her, suggesting that her side of the story was very different to the Shearmans, also suggesting that quite a bit of what she was saying couldn't be substantiated, and also pointing out to her that Donald Shearman's ministry had been very greatly valued by people. That letter put Beth off attempting to be heard for 5 years.
Beth is pretty depressed. I mean, she's in a real slump. But little did she know that Archbishop Hollingworth had some prior form in that he already knew of other pedophiles within the Anglican Diocese of Brisbane. Reverend John Elliott confessed to Hollingworth about some of the crimes he'd committed against children. Elliott was the bursar of the Church of England Grammar School and also involved in an Anglican youth group, similar to the Scouts. When the Archbishop arranged a psychiatric assessment of Elliott, the report indicated that Elliott was not only a pedophile, but he was untreatable and that he was a danger to children. Despite this expert opinion, Hollingworth kept Elliott as a priest.
Dear John, having given your situation long and prayerful thought,
And although he said he couldn't have access to children, he still could officiate.
I am not taking disciplinary action as I and the Church could be seen as culpable.
Brisbane's Anglican Archbishop Peter Hollingworth will be moving to Canberra at the end of June as Governor-General.
The 66-year-old wants to be known as a man for all people.
In 2001, Prime Minister Howard announced that Archbishop Hollingworth would be the next Governor-General. We have here potentially, a conflict between the Church and the state. Now, this in itself was extremely controversial.
I, Peter John Hollingworth, do swear that I will well and truly serve Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
There was also a great deal of, how shall I say, ill feeling, because many of us knew what had happened in his career as Archbishop and how abuse had not been exposed and dealt with adequately.
Dr. Hollingworth, do you have anything you want to say about the case?
Not today, thank you.
When do you expect to be able to respond to the allegations, Dr. Hollingworth?
Yesterday, Peter Hollingworth defended himself against claims that as Brisbane's Anglican Archbishop, he failed to act on allegations of sexual abuse.
And I thought, oh, I'm brave enough now. I'm going to ring a journalist and tell him what happened with me. And it was used on the front of a Sydney Morning Herald. And I thought, well, there it is, it's out there now. And it was very satisfying to see it. But a couple of days later, there was Peter Hollingworth in Australian Story.
The great tragedy about this situation is that the genesis of it was 40 years ago, and it occurred between a young priest and a teenage girl who was under the age of consent. I believe she was more than 14. And I also understand that many years later in adult life, their relationship resumed, and it was partly a pastoral relationship and it was partly something more. My belief is that this was not sex abuse. There was no suggestion of rape or anything like that. Quite the contrary. My information is that it was rather the other way around.
I was gutted, absolutely gutted.
When organisations don't respond appropriately to victims of child abuse, it's called secondary abuse. This was the most extraordinary public display of secondary abuse I've ever seen.
When the Governor-General emerged from his meeting with the Prime Minister this morning, he had a carefully prepared defence of his most controversial comments on Australian Story.
I thought I was talking about an adult relationship, and I want to make an unreserved apology to the woman concerned and to the whole of the Australian public.
He clearly feels that what he was meaning to convey has been taken in another context.
The Governor-General has since telephoned the woman involved to say sorry. His office says Dr. Hollingworth also told the woman he understands how hurtful the comments were.
He hadn't made a decent apology to me. I was still annoyed and not happy with the way he had dealt with me. It wasn't satisfactory.
I present to you Philip, Archbishop of Brisbane.
By this point, we have a new Archbishop, Archbishop Aspinall, appointed for the Diocese of Brisbane. And Archbishop Aspinall hits the ground running. He suddenly takes action. He defrocks pedophiles. He removes people in powerful positions within the Anglican Church and the schools. Also at this time, Archbishop Aspinall established an inquiry. It investigated complaints by several people. Beth was one of those.
The complainant had sought resolution of the complaint for many years.
Importantly, and this was very, very important for Beth, Archbishop Aspinall actually defrocks, finally, Donald Shearman.
He can no longer function anywhere as a bishop or a priest or a deacon.
And it begs the question, of course, why weren't all these actions taken before with Archbishop Hollingworth?
Tonight, the waiting is over. After weeks of pressure, the Governor-General is going.
My decision to resign as Governor-General was taken after long and soul-searching consideration.
Good morning.
After Hollingworth resigns, he ultimately returns to his hometown of Melbourne, and the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne embraces him. He continues to be a bishop. He continues to have holy orders and continues to officiate.
The Bathurst Diocese finally settled some money on me, which enabled me to finance buying a home for myself. I just ran away and hid. Come on, Bertie, come on, come on. In 2009, I moved to country Victoria and bought my home there. Come on. And had an irrational idea that perhaps Donald Shearman would join me when his wife died, foolish as it seems. I still had many of his belongings in a suitcase, his pectoral cross and a bishop's ring. I was just keeping them all safe for him, that's all. And that never happened.
The sustainability of victimhood in abusive relationships all has something to do with some kind of love. We don't want to see ourselves as a victim, so it can go on for a long time.
The Prime Minister announces a royal commission into the sexual abuse of children.
Too many children have suffered child abuse.
Well, when Julia Gillard announced the Royal Commission, I thought that was a very important step. There were thousands of victims, hundreds of perpetrators in many religious organisations. And I think that gave Beth courage to continue the fight because she realised that she wasn't alone.
The Royal Commission didn't hold a hearing into Beth's story, but they did hold hearings into the Anglican Diocese of Brisbane.
Former Governor-General Peter Hollingworth today apologised to an abuse survivor.
For Hollingworth, why has it taken 13 years to apologise?
He had failed to remove pedophile priest John Elliott.
To BYB and your family, I'm deeply sorry that I was not sufficiently sensitive to your needs.
The Royal Commission was critical of Peter Hollingworth and the Anglican Church. It said that he made a serious error of judgment in allowing pedophile priests to keep working. Even after those findings were made public, Peter Hollingworth retains his holy orders. For victim survivors, that was a big blow.
Soon after, we heard that the Anglican Church, through its independent body, CUURA, was going to hold its own inquiry into what had happened to people like Beth, an inquiry into Hollingworth's responses to abuse. We briefly felt optimistic.
And it's high stakes because if the church does defrock Peter Hollingworth, it's a pretty big call. Normally it takes 6 weeks to 12 months for these issues to be resolved. This one's been dragging on for 5 years.
The disgraced former Governor-General Peter Hollingworth has fronted a secret hearing in Melbourne that will decide whether he should be stripped of his holy orders.
The hearing was supposed to be in November last year, and it was once again cancelled at the last minute. It was then scheduled again for February this year. We entered the hearing room and there were 15 to 20 people around this very large board table. Beth was placed right beside Hollingworth and his legal team.
After I said good morning to him, I realised who it was, and then I saw his big bishop's ring on his hand, and I thought, isn't this strange? Here am I here, and I've got all this stuff to talk about you, and you're sitting beside me. And it's come to this.
Beth is not a party to the case. She is but a witness. All she could do was read her victim impact statement.
And then we were ushered out, and that was it. We have no idea what else has gone on, who else has appeared.
Dr Hollingworth has not responded to requests for comment. The hearing is due to conclude on Wednesday.
The length of time that it's taken for the matters concerning Peter Hollingworth to be dealt with and finalised have certainly raised concerns for me, and I'm called for a review of our processes.
If you were to give Peter Hollingworth advice, just lastly?
I don't know all the circumstances. I only know the information that is available. I think, though, I would say, on the basis of all that I'm aware of, it would be a good thing to step back and resign his orders. I think that would be a reasonable thing. I think there's been enough information around through the inquiries that have taken place for the good of the people who've been impacted, for the good of the reputation of the church, even though that's very much secondary. I think that would be my advice.
The Anglican Church's complaints body has ruled former Governor-General Peter Hollingworth should not be stripped of his holy orders, despite finding that he allowed pedophiles to stay in the church.
As Beth's lawyer, I received the decision from the board. It found that Dr Hollingworth is guilty of misconduct. There were 10 allegations. 3 of those were dismissed and he was found guilty of 7. An example of the misconduct is that Hollingworth kept known pedophiles in ministry. Another is that he caused additional trauma and harm to our client, Beth Heinrich, due to his comments in Australian Story 20 years ago. Despite these findings, the board recommended that Dr Hollingworth could remain in active ministry. He could remain being a bishop. The only condition for that was that he apologise to our client and to one other victim. I had to call Beth. It's a pretty devastating decision, I think.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's ridiculous.
But I'm also concerned about you and how this is impacting you.
The longer it goes on, Judy, the bigger the problem becomes.
Absolutely.
It's a disappointment, and I just wonder what I can do and what the other survivors can do who were re-traumatised by Peter Hollingworth when they went to him for help and support. I don't know what the next chapter will be. How many? 6, 8. Donald Schumann died in late 2019. I haven't thrown any of his things away. I'm not ready to put on a bonfire yet. I think my life was stalled when I was 14. You know, I would have gone on and done something. And so this standing up to Peter Hollingworth is in some way making up for what was stolen from me. I think my parents would be very proud. I can rest easy because I've done the best I can. I don't think I caused chaos in the Anglican Church, but if I did, I'd like the idea.